Dan McClellan takes scriptures out of context to try to claim that Yahweh is receiving an inheritance in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8 and 9. As you can see here in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 6, it explains that Yahweh chose Israel as his possession, not that he is receiving them as a possession. So that was the Dead Sea Scrolls saying in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 6 that Yahweh chose Israel as his possession. And now in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 35 in the Codex Vaticanus, since there's no Dead Sea Scroll manuscript for Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 35, it does say Kyrios, which is the primary substitute for the Tetragrammaton, that he is God and there is no other, which matches the Masoretic text reading that Yahweh is God and there is no other. Even in Deuteronomy 7 and verse 7, it explains again that Yahweh chose Israel. Then in Deuteronomy 32, right, the chapter that Dan is reading from, he's reading verses 7 through 9, right? But he does not mention verse 6, which explains that Yahweh created Israel, right? Therefore, how can it be possible that the creator of Israel, and when Deuteronomy is explaining that Yahweh is God and there is no other, right? How can he possibly be receiving an inheritance of his people? Notice how in Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it does not say El. It simply says Elyon, the Most High. Okay, and there's no archaeological evidence of the Canaanite god El being mentioned as El Elyon. The earliest inscription that includes Elyon outside of the Bible would be from 750 BCE. They call it the Sefer Treaty inscription. That's in Aramaic, I understand, and it mentions El separate from Elyon, right? It says El and Elyon. So even in the Lexham Dead Sea Scroll interlinear Bible, they translate the word as a heritage, all right? And when we look at the actual word, it can mean possession, property as well. And I was incorrect, and Dan McClellan corrected me. I assumed that possession was the primary definition because of how it's laid out here. However, like, it could be true that inheritance is the primary definition of the word, but the word is diverse and it can mean property, it can mean possession, and definitely even his own lexicon that he was claiming was more accurate than the Brown Jaffer Briggs says the same thing, that it can mean possession. All right, so the context is that Yahweh is the creator of Israel, that he is God and there is no other in Deuteronomy, which he explains predates Exodus and Genesis according to his worldview, which is not a scholarly consensus. However, we can concede to the context of Deuteronomy that Yahweh is God, there is no other. He created Israel. Therefore, it can't be possible to interpret this word as only meaning inheritance. And plenty of Bibles translate it correctly, meaning possession, like God's Word translation is probably one of the most accurate, being, but the Lord's people were his property and Jacob was his own possession. Even in the New Living Translation, for the people of Israel belong to Yahweh, Jacob is his special possession. Furthermore, the earliest mention of El Elyon is in the Bible, right? In the context of Genesis chapter 14, they say that El Elyon is the creator of heavens and earth. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, Genesis 2 verse 7 says that Yahweh created man. So they're mentioning Yahweh as the creator. And in the Codex Vaticanus, so in the Codex Vaticanus for Genesis 2 and verse 7, it doesn't say Kyrios, which is the primary substitute for the Tetragrammaton. It says Theos. And so this is evident that Yahweh can be substituted with Theos, which there are sources online that explain that even though Kyrios is the primary substitute, that it can be Theos, like we just demonstrated, and also Ton Theon. So in Genesis 14 and verse 22 of the Codex Vaticanus, it can be understood that it is saying Yahweh the Most High. There is no Dead Sea Scroll manuscript for Genesis 14 and verse 22. This is why in the Masoretic text, when it says that Yahweh is the Most High God, scholars are trying to debate that, well, it's not in the Septuagint, so they're trying to argue that it's interpreted as El Elyon. So in the Masoretic text, they say in Genesis 2 and verse 4 that Yahweh is the creator of the heavens and the earth. So therefore, even if you don't want to believe that in Genesis 14 and verse 22, that it's saying that Yahweh is the Most High, and that it says only El Elyon, like Dan McClellan is arguing, then the context of Genesis is still that Yahweh is the creator of the heavens and the earth. And since in the Codex Vaticanus, it only says Theos for Genesis 2 and verse 4 and not Kyrios, I demonstrated that Theos and Genesis 2 and verse 7 is a match in the Dead Sea Scrolls with Yahweh. So in the Codex Vaticanus, it very well can also be saying that Yahweh is the creator of the heavens and the earth.